Welcome to Night Owl Podcast History. I am so glad you are here tonight. Whether you are drifting off to sleep, taking a quiet walk, or simply curious about the echoes of the past that still shape our present. Tonight, we are beginning a journey into one of the most dramatic turning points in modern history, a war that swallowed empires, redrew maps, and left scars still visible today, the First World War. But here's the twist. We are not going to rush through battles or drown in dates. Instead, we will take our time, moving slowly through the background, the atmosphere, the people, and the decisions that set the stage for catastrophe. Because the question is not only why did the First War begin, but also why, in its early days, so many people believed it would be the war to end all wars. If that sounds intriguing, take a moment to follow and subscribe to Night Owl Podcast History. That way, you will never miss another story, whether it is about empires rising or the small details of daily life that make history feel alive. And if you enjoy tonight's episode, sharing it with a friend who loves history is one of the best ways to support this channel. Now, settle in. Imagine yourself in the twilight years of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th. The world is buzzing with invention and optimism. Electric light, telephones, railroads, automobiles, even the first airplanes. Science promises progress. Medicine is extending lives. Cities are growing taller with steel and glass. For many in Europe, it feels like the modern age has finally arrived. And yet, beneath the surface of this glittering progress lies a darker reality, an arms race, old rivalries, wounded pride, and alliances so tangled that one spark might set the whole structure ablaze. That spark would come, and when it did, the world would tumble headlong into 4 years of destruction on a scale no one had seen before. To understand why the First World War began, we must step back to the late 19th century, when Europe was dominated by great powers locked in a delicate balance. There was Britain, still ruling the seas with the largest empire the world had ever seen. There was France, proud but still haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. There was Germany, newly unified, ambitious, and eager to claim its place in the sun. Austria-Hungary, a sprawling, fragile empire of many nationalities. Russia, vast and powerful, watching over its Slavic cousins in the Balkans. And finally, the Ottoman Empire, once mighty, now weakened, and nicknamed the sick man of Europe. At the heart of the story is Germany. Before 1871, Germany was not a single nation, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. That changed when Otto von Bismarck, the master statesman, forged unity through war and diplomacy, culminating in the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. This was not just the birth of a nation, it was a declaration of power. France, humiliated and forced to give up Alsace and Lorraine, would never forget this wound. Bismarck, however, was careful. He knew that a newly powerful Germany could alarm its neighbors, so he built a web of alliances to keep France isolated and to maintain peace. He once said that preventive war is like committing suicide from fear of death. His diplomacy was cautious, pragmatic, and deeply personal. But after Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II steered Germany in a very different direction, less cautious, more aggressive, driven by a desire for colonies and recognition. This change unsettled the balance. Germany began building a navy to rival Britain's Royal Navy, sparking an arms race at sea. France, no longer isolated, moved closer to Russia. Britain, traditionally splendidly isolated, began to seek allies as German ambition grew. By the early 20th century, Europe was divided into two rival camps, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. On paper, these alliances were meant to deter war. In practice, they created a trap. If two nations quarreled, their allies might be dragged in, and soon the quarrel could become a continental war. And then there was the Balkans. Imagine a small, mountainous region, restless with nationalist ambition, pressed between empires. Serbia dreamed of uniting all South Slavs into one nation, but Austria-Hungary feared that dream because within its own borders lived millions of Slavs who might want the same. Russia saw itself as protector of the Slavs, while Austria-Hungary sought to keep them in check. The Balkans were called the powder keg of Europe, and the fuse was already smoldering. The first sparks came with the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, where small nations, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, fought to push the Ottomans out of Europe. Victories and rivalries left the region tense. Serbia emerged stronger, Austria-Hungary more nervous, and Europe more aware that one crisis there could spiral out of control. Still, in 1914, few ordinary people imagined a world war. Life went on, with parades, markets, songs, and optimism. But in Sarajevo, on June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist. The shots echoed not only in the narrow streets of Sarajevo, but across all of Europe. The assassination could have been just another Balkan crisis, but Austria-Hungary, eager to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, saw it as the moment to act. Backed by Germany, it sent an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia accepted most of its demands, but balked at a few that would have undermined its sovereignty. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. The alliances snapped into place like a row of falling dominoes. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France prepared to support its ally. Germany, planning to strike quickly, invaded Belgium to outflank French defenses. And Britain, protector of Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Within a week, the great powers of Europe were at war. Crowds cheered in the streets, believing the war would be short, decisive, even glorious. Young men rushed to enlist, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Politicians promised it would be the war to end all wars, a cleansing storm that would sweep away old grievances and usher in peace. No one yet imagined the trenches, the poison gas, the endless mud, the millions of dead. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," was born in this wave of optimism and propaganda. It carried the hope that by fighting this great conflict, humanity would purge itself of war's necessity. But, as we now know, it was a tragic illusion. As night falls in our story, Europe stands on the brink of something it does not yet understand. The old world of empires, horse-drawn carriages, and aristocratic diplomacy is about to collide with machine guns, tanks, and total war. The descent into the abyss has begun. The summer of 1914 was one of contradictions. Across Europe, ordinary people were basking in sunshine, picnicking in parks, and enjoying long days that seemed to stretch with possibility. But in capitals from Vienna to Berlin, from St. Petersburg to London, telegraphs rattled with urgent messages, and armies stirred from peacetime slumber. By August, the war had begun, and almost overnight, the continent transformed. The spark, as we saw in Sarajevo, had been the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But the fire spread not by chance alone. It spread through decisions, calculations, and a plan that had been quietly waiting in drawers and military offices for years, the Schlieffen Plan. Germany, caught between two great powers, France to the west and Russia to the east, feared being crushed in a two-front war. The plan, devised by Count Alfred von Schlieffen before his retirement in 1906, was meant to solve this dilemma. It envisioned a lightning strike, a massive German army sweeping through neutral Belgium, swinging down into northern France and capturing Paris in just a few weeks. With France knocked out quickly, Germany could then turn eastward, slow but vast Russia still mobilizing its armies. It was bold, it was ruthless, and it was, in hindsight, fatally flawed. For one thing, it assumed Belgium would not resist. It assumed Britain would remain neutral. It assumed that French morale would collapse swiftly, and that Russia would take many months to mobilize. All these assumptions would soon be tested, and found wanting. On August 4, 1914, German troops crossed into Belgium. The small kingdom had declared neutrality, but its resistance was fierce. The fortified city of Liège held out longer than the Germans expected, slowing their advance. And the German violation of Belgian neutrality brought Britain into the war. What might have remained a continental conflict now expanded into a global one, with the Royal Navy's dominance ensuring that the war would reach far beyond Europe. As German armies surged through Belgium, they left destruction in their wake. Villages burned, civilians executed, ancient towns shelled. These atrocities shocked the world and hardened Allied resolve. The image of poor little Belgium became a rallying cry, painting Germany as the aggressor in the eyes of many neutral nations. By late August, German forces had swept into northern France. The French army, guided by a doctrine known as Plan 17, launched head-on attacks into Alsace and Lorraine. They wore bright blue coats and red trousers, an echo of 19th-century glory, but met modern machine guns and artillery. The result was slaughter. Thousands fell in the opening battles, entire regiments cut down. The French offensive collapsed, and German armies pressed forward. It seemed for a moment that the Schlieffen Plan might succeed. German soldiers marched ever closer to Paris. The French government evacuated to Bordeaux, fearing the capital would fall. But war, as history so often reminds us, does not follow the neat lines of a planner's map. At the beginning of September, the exhausted French and British forces rallied along the Marne River. The German right wing, overstretched and tired, left a gap in its lines. French General Joseph Joffre seized the chance. Reinforcements were rushed to the front, famously carried in Parisian taxicabs commandeered for the war effort. It was a symbolic gesture, but it embodied the desperate determination of the French people. From September 6 to 12, 1914, the First Battle of the Marne raged. Over 1 million men clashed in a titanic struggle. At the climax, French and British troops pushed the Germans back. It was not a decisive victory in the old sense. There were no sweeping cavalry charges or triumphant parades. Instead, it was the moment when Germany's dream of a quick war died. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Paris was saved, and Germany would not have the rapid knockout blow it had counted on. What followed was something no one had fully foreseen: a race to the sea. Both sides tried to outflank each other northward, moving toward the English Channel. Each time one side shifted, the other shifted too, like two wrestlers locked in a deadly embrace. By the end of the autumn, both armies had stretched from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea. There was no room left to maneuver, so they dug in. Trenches, zigzagging lines of earthworks, barbed wire, and dugouts. At first, they were meant as temporary defenses, but as the rains came and the soil turned to mud, the trenches deepened, expanded, and hardened into a new form of warfare. Soldiers carved out living spaces in the earth, building wooden supports, sandbag walls, and duckboards to keep from drowning in the muck. What had begun as a war of movement became a war of position. By Christmas 1914, hundreds of miles of trenches scarred the landscape of France and Belgium. Between them lay the most dangerous place of all, no man's land, a wasteland of shell craters, shattered trees, and corpses. To cross it was to invite death from machine guns and artillery. Yet generals on both sides still clung to hopes of breakthroughs, still ordered attacks that hurled men into the storm of fire. And yet, even amid the horror, humanity sometimes flickered. On Christmas Eve, in sectors along the Western Front, soldiers heard carols drifting from the enemy trenches. Candles appeared on parapets. Small groups ventured into no man's land to exchange greetings, gifts, even games of football. The Christmas truce of 1914 was brief and unofficial, quickly ended by higher command. But it remains one of the most poignant reminders that even in the darkest times, ordinary men yearned for peace. But such moments were rare. For most soldiers, the trenches became a world of mud, lice, rats, and constant fear. Shells exploded day and night. The dead lay unburied. The smell of gas gangrene and decay mingled with the stench of latrines. Letters from home were clutched like treasures, small anchors to normal life in a world turned upside down. As 1914 drew to a close, the war had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The optimism of August, the cheers, the promises of being home by Christmas was gone. In its place was the grim reality of a conflict that would drag on for years. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," still lingered on politicians' lips. But for the men in the trenches, the war was not ending. It was only beginning. When the soldiers of Europe marched to war in 1914, they carried with them a picture of battle shaped by the 19th century. Short campaigns, brilliant maneuvers, glorious charges. But by the dawn of 1915, those illusions had drowned in the mud of the trenches. What emerged was a new world of warfare, one that seemed endless, merciless, and profoundly different from anything that had come before. Let us pause for a moment and imagine what daily life was like for an ordinary soldier in the trenches. The front lines stretched for hundreds of miles, from the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland. Along this scar of earth, men lived in ditches cut into the soil, reinforced with timber, sandbags, and corrugated iron. At first, these trenches were shallow and crude. But as weeks turned to months, they deepened into labyrinths, complete with dugouts, command posts, and communication trenches winding back to the rear. Life in the trenches was not constant fighting. Battles were brutal but infrequent. Far more often, soldiers endured monotony punctuated by sudden terror. A typical day might begin with the stand-to at dawn. Both sides feared surprise attacks at first light, so soldiers lined the parapets, rifles ready, straining their eyes against the gray mist. Afterward came the daily routines, repairing sandbags, draining water, mending duckboards, or writing letters home. And always the mud. Rain turned the ground into a sucking, endless swamp. Soldiers stood for hours in waterlogged boots, their feet swollen and pale. A condition called trench foot set in, where flesh rotted from constant dampness. The cure was simple in theory: dry socks, clean boots, but impossible in practice. Commanders urged men to rub whale oil into their feet, but oil could not banish the cold mud that seeped into every crevice. Some men lost toes, some lost entire feet. Then there were the rats. They thrived in the trenches, fattened on unburied corpses and scraps of food. Soldiers wrote of rats so large they scurried over sleeping men without fear. One memoir described a man waking to find a rat chewing at his boot leather. Another told of rats bold enough to tug at soldiers' hair. There was no way to escape them. They were part of the ecosystem of trench life, as inevitable as the lice that infested uniforms and caused constant itching. Food was another misery. Soldiers in the British trenches often received bully beef, tinned corned beef, and hard biscuits so solid they had to be soaked before they could be eaten. In French trenches, the rations sometimes included wine, but it was thin comfort against hunger. German soldiers fared somewhat better in 1915, supplied with black bread, sausage, and potatoes, though shortages would worsen as the war dragged on. Hot meals were rare. Tea, when available, was cherished like gold. Sleep was scarce. Artillery shells crashed day and night, shaking the ground and rattling men awake. Sometimes the barrages lasted hours, days even, drumming on the nerves until men broke down in tears or hysteria. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was then called shell shock. Soldiers trembled uncontrollably, lost the ability to speak, or collapsed in catatonic states. At first, officers treated it as cowardice. Some men were even court-martialed. Only later did the medical profession begin to grasp the psychological toll of constant bombardment. Yet for all this suffering, the trenches were not silent. Soldiers sang songs, told jokes, and carved graffiti into wooden beams. They shared cigarettes, played cards, and wrote letters, thousands of letters, pouring out their hopes and fears to mothers, wives, sweethearts, and children. In some sectors, opposing trenches were so close, sometimes less than 100 yards, that men shouted insults or jokes across no man's land. In quieter moments, they even exchanged gifts by tossing them into the open. Still, the killing was relentless. Snipers scanned the parapets through rifle scopes, ready to shoot at the slightest movement. Soldiers learned never to raise their heads above the sandbags. Machine guns, water-cooled and capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, made any daylight advance suicidal. Artillery, however, was the true killer of the First World War. Massive guns hurled shells weighing hundreds of pounds, blasting craters into the earth, shattering bodies, and burying men alive. Shrapnel tore through flesh. The constant thunder of guns deafened some permanently. And then, in 1915, a new horror appeared: poison gas. On April 22nd, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released chlorine gas from cylinders. A greenish cloud drifted across the battlefield, seeping into trenches where French colonial troops from Algeria held the line. The gas burned lungs and eyes, causing men to cough, choke, and collapse in agony. Many fled, leaving a gaping hole in the defenses. Only hasty counterattacks prevented disaster. Gas soon became a fixture of the war. Both sides used it: chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, each more insidious than the last. Soldiers wore crude cloth masks at first, soaked in urine or chemicals to filter the air. Later came rubberized respirators, but even these offered imperfect protection. The terror of gas lay not only in its cruelty, but in its invisibility. A shell could land with little sound, releasing a cloud that drifted silently, sinking into low ground where men slept. To breathe was to die slowly. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war took a different shape. There, vast distances allowed for movement. Russian armies, immense but poorly supplied, clashed with Germany and Austria-Hungary in battles that sprawled across hundreds of miles. The Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 had already been a disaster for Russia, with over 100,000 men killed or captured. In 1915, the Central Powers launched the Gorlitz-Tarnów offensive, driving deep into Russian territory, capturing Poland, and forcing millions of civilians to flee in one of the largest refugee crises of the war. But it was the Western Front, with its trenches and stalemates, that came to symbolize the Great War in the popular imagination. By the end of 1915, it was clear that neither side could achieve a breakthrough. Attack followed attack, each costing thousands of lives for a few yards of ground. The names of battles, Ypres, Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, became synonyms for bloodshed without gain. Politicians and generals searched desperately for ways to break the deadlock. Some looked to new technology. airplanes to spot enemy positions, tanks still in early development, massive artillery barrages meant to shatter defenses. Others turned to strategy, opening new fronts in distant lands. In 1915, the Allies launched the Gallipoli campaign, hoping to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia. The plan was bold but poorly executed. At Gallipoli, Allied troops, Australians, New Zealanders, British, and French, landed on steep, defended shores. They found themselves pinned down under fire, fighting not only the enemy, but also disease, heat, and flies. After months of stalemate, the campaign ended in evacuation. The cost was enormous, and Gallipoli became a national wound, especially in Australia and New Zealand, where the memory of the Anzac troops shaped national identity for generations. Back in Europe, civilians also began to feel the weight of total war. Men left factories and fields to fight, so women stepped into roles once close to them. They worked in munitions plants, producing the shells that thundered on the front. They served as nurses, tending to the broken bodies that arrived in endless streams at field hospitals. In towns and cities, people endured rationing, air raids from German Zeppelins, and the constant dread of telegrams bringing news of loved ones lost. The war was no longer just battles at the front. It was a contest of societies, economies, and endurance. Every resource, food, fuel, steel, coal, was directed toward the war effort. Propaganda posters urged citizens to sacrifice, to save, to enlist. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers increased production. Even art and literature bent under the weight of war, as poets and writers struggled to capture its madness. By the close of 1915, the optimism of 1914 had long since evaporated. The war was not ending. It was spreading, deepening, consuming. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," sounded less like a promise and more like a desperate prayer. And yet, no one could step away. Leaders on all sides feared that peace without victory would mean defeat, humiliation, collapse. So the soldiers stayed in their trenches. The guns thundered, the mud thickened, and the world braced itself for what 1916 would bring: Verdun, the Somme, and battles so vast they seemed to devour entire nations. By the beginning of 1916, Europe had already endured nearly 2 years of war. Hundreds of thousands were dead, millions wounded, and still the front lines remained almost exactly where they had begun. Governments promised victory, generals planned new offensives, but for the soldiers in the trenches, the war seemed endless. And in 1916, it reached a new intensity that would mark the year as one of the bloodiest in human history. Let us begin with Verdun. Verdun was not just a fortress city in northeastern France, it was a symbol. For centuries, it had stood as a bulwark on the borderlands, a place steeped in French history and pride. To attack Verdun was not merely to seize ground, it was to wound the soul of France. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, understood this. His strategy was not to break through the French lines, but to bleed France white, to force it to sacrifice men and morale in a battle of attrition. Verdun, he believed, would be the trap. On February 21, 1916, the German offensive began. It opened with an artillery barrage unlike anything seen before. Over 1 million shells fired in the first week, raining down on the French positions. The earth itself seemed to convulse. Villages vanished. Forests became wastelands of shattered stumps. Survivors spoke of the sky filled with smoke, the ground trembling as if the world were ending. The French defenders, outnumbered and battered, clung desperately to their positions. General Philippe Pétain, who took command of the defense, issued an order that would become legendary. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. Convoys of trucks, known as the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, carried endless supplies of men, ammunition, and food into Verdun. Day after day, week after week, reinforcements streamed in, even as casualties mounted. The battle raged for months. Forts like Douaumont and Vaux changed hands amid desperate fighting. Men fought not for sweeping maneuvers, but for a few yards of rubble, a trench line, a crater. Conditions were hellish. Mud mixed with blood, corpses unburied, air choked with dust and gas. Soldiers described living among the dead, unable to escape the stench of decay. One French officer wrote, "Men are being consumed in this furnace. Every hour 1,000 die." By December 1916, Verdun had become the longest battle of the war, lasting nearly 10 months. France had held. The Germans had failed to break their spirit. But the cost was staggering, around 300,000 dead and nearly 800,000 wounded. Verdun was not victory, it was survival paid for in blood. While Verdun consumed the French, the Allies prepared another offensive to relieve the pressure, the Somme. The Somme, planned by the British and French, was meant to break the stalemate with a massive attack on German lines. It would also mark Britain's first truly large-scale involvement, as the British Expeditionary Force swelled with volunteers, Kitchener's army, men who had answered the call in 1914, believing in honor, duty, and quick victory. By 1916, they were in the trenches, waiting. The offensive began on July 1, 1916, with an artillery bombardment that lasted a week. Over 1 million shells pounded German lines. Commanders believed the bombardment would destroy barbed wire, crush trenches, and annihilate defenders. British soldiers were told they could walk across no man's land and occupy the ruins. But the Germans had dug deep. Their bunkers, reinforced with concrete, shielded them from the worst. The bombardment cut some wire but left much intact. And when the British whistles blew at 7:30 a.m. on July 1 and tens of thousands of men climbed from their trenches, they were met with machine gun fire. The first day of the Somme was the bloodiest in British military history. Nearly 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, in a single day. Entire battalions were wiped out. The PALS battalions, units of friends, co-workers, and neighbors who had enlisted together, suffered especially. In towns across Britain, whole generations of young men vanished. Yet the battle continued. Week after week, the British and French pushed forward, yard by yard. New weapons appeared. The tank, a lumbering armored vehicle, made its debut in September 1916. It broke through barbed wire and crossed trenches, but in small numbers and plagued by mechanical failures, it was not yet decisive. Airplanes, once used mainly for reconnaissance, now engaged in dogfights in the skies above the battlefield. The modern battlefield was taking shape. The Somme became a war of grinding attrition, like Verdun. Villages, woods, and ridges were captured, lost, and recaptured. Shells churned the ground into mud. Rain turned craters into lakes. Soldiers drowned in the mire. By the time the offensive ended in November, the Allies had advanced about 6 miles. The cost? Over 1 million casualties combined, British, French, and German. Verdun and the Somme together epitomized the futility of the Western Front. Unimaginable human suffering for minimal territorial gain. And yet, they also revealed the grim logic of industrial war. Victory would not come from brilliance or maneuver, but from endurance, from which side could sustain losses longer. For the soldiers, the battles of 1916 were seared into memory. Survivors carried scars, physical and psychological, for life. Writers and poets later tried to capture the experience. Wilfred Owen, a young British officer who fought in the Somme, described the pity of war in verses filled with gas, mud, and broken bodies. His poetry, published after his death in 1918, would shape how generations remembered the war. Beyond the battlefields, 1916 brought other upheavals. On the Eastern Front, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive, one of its most successful operations, smashing Austrian lines and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But the cost to Russia was enormous, and its fragile economy and society strained further under the burden of war. At sea, the conflict also escalated. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships that carried supplies to Britain. In May 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania had already shocked the world, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, including Americans. By 1916, submarine warfare continued to poison relations between Germany and the neutral United States, setting the stage for future involvement. And in Dublin, Ireland, Easter 1916 saw a rebellion against British rule. Though suppressed, it revealed how the war stirred unrest far from the front lines, reshaping politics and empires in ways that would echo long after the guns fell silent. As the year ended, Europe was exhausted but no closer to peace. Millions were dead. Entire landscapes were scarred beyond recognition. And yet, leaders pressed on, convinced that the next offensive, the next breakthrough, would bring victory. For those who lived through 1916, the war no longer seemed like a storm that would pass. It felt like a permanent state of existence, an iron grip on the world that refused to release. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," must have sounded bitter by then. If anything, 1916 suggested that war had no end at all, that it had become a machine, grinding men and nations alike. But history, even in its darkest moments, always turns. And in 1917, new forces would enter the stage: the United States, revolution in Russia, and strategies that would shift the balance. The war was about to widen, and its consequences would stretch across the globe. By the winter of 1917, Europe was staggering under the weight of war. The battles of Verdun and the Somme had consumed armies like firewood. Entire landscapes had been reduced to wastelands, and yet the front lines had barely shifted. Soldiers endured mud, cold, and constant bombardment. Civilians endured rationing, shortages, and grief. For many, it seemed the war might never end. But in 1917, events far beyond the trenches would transform the conflict, injecting new energy, shattering old empires, and setting the stage for the final act of the Great War. Let us begin in Russia. The Russian Empire had entered the war with immense manpower, but weak industry, poor infrastructure, and fragile political stability. By 1917, the strain was unbearable. Millions of Russian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Supplies were desperately short: rifles, boots, even food. Soldiers sometimes went into battle unarmed, waiting to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Morale collapsed. On the home front, hunger and frustration boiled over. Bread queues stretched for hours in Petrograd, the capital. Workers struck, soldiers mutiny, and the old autocracy teetered on the brink. In March 1917, protests erupted into revolution. Tsar Nicholas II, who had ruled with divine authority, was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had reigned for over 3 centuries, was gone. A provisional government took power, promising democracy and reform. But it made one fatal decision: to continue the war. Russian soldiers, already exhausted, felt betrayed. Radical voices grew louder, among them the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who demanded peace, land, and bread. By November 1917, a second revolution swept the country. The Bolsheviks seized power, and Russia began its exit from the war. For Germany, this was a gift. If Russia withdrew, Germany could shift its armies from the Eastern Front to the West, launching new offensives before American troops arrived. But the Russian collapse also unleashed chaos, civil war, foreign interventions, and years of bloodshed that would shape the 20th century. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had watched the war with wary distance. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Most Americans wanted no part of Europe's quarrels, but German actions slowly changed that. Unrestricted submarine warfare was the key. In early 1917, Germany announced it would sink any ship, military or civilian, bound for Allied ports. The goal was to starve Britain into surrender. But this meant attacking neutral ships, including American ones. In February, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted, a secret German proposal to Mexico, promising support if it joined the war against the United States. When the news broke, American outrage boiled over. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Wilson framed it not as a fight for territory, but as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. For the weary Allies, American entry was a lifeline. The U.S. Army was small, but America's industrial and financial power was vast. Fresh troops, supplies, and resources would eventually tip the balance. Yet in 1917, American involvement was still limited. It would take months to train and transport troops across the Atlantic. For much of the year, the Allies still fought alone, and their own morale was crumbling. In France, the army launched the Nivelle Offensive in April 1917, promising a decisive breakthrough. It failed catastrophically. Thousands died for little gain. Soldiers mutinied. Whole units refused to attack, though they still defended their lines. General Pétain restored order with a mix of discipline and reforms, improving food, leave, and conditions. But the message was clear. The French army would not endure endless futile assaults. In Britain, too, frustration grew. The Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, began in July 1917. The goal was to break through in Flanders, capturing ridges and pushing toward German submarine bases. But rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men, horses, and even tanks sank into the mud. Shell craters filled with water, swallowing the wounded alive. The battle dragged on for months, costing hundreds of thousands of lives for just a few miles of ground. Passchendaele became a byword for futility, a symbol of war's endless grinding horror. Amidst this despair, the war expanded further. In the Middle East, British forces fought the Ottomans in campaigns that stretched across deserts and ancient cities. In April 1917, British troops captured Baghdad. In December, after fierce fighting, they entered Jerusalem. Arab rebels, encouraged by British promises, rose against Ottoman rule, guided in part by British officer T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia. In Italy, the war brought disaster. At the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, Austro-Hungarian and German forces broke through Italian lines. The Italian army collapsed, retreating in chaos. Hundreds of thousands were captured. The Allies rushed reinforcements to stabilize the front, but the blow was devastating to Italian morale. By late 1917, the World War truly lived up to its name. From the muddy trenches of Flanders to the deserts of Arabia, from the fields of Italy to the steppes of Russia, millions fought and suffered. Yet, even as hope faded, the phrase, "the war to end all wars," persisted in speeches and newspapers. People clung to it like a charm, a promise that the bloodshed must mean something. Surely, after such sacrifice, humanity would learn. But on the ground, among the soldiers, that promise rang hollow. In the diaries of 1917, one finds despair, irony, dark humor. A British private wrote, "We are told this is the war to end wars. God help us if it is not." As 1917 drew to a close, the war seemed balanced on a knife's edge. Russia had fallen away. America had entered, but its strength was still gathering. Germany prepared for one last desperate gamble. The year ahead, 1918, would decide everything. It would bring offensives of breathtaking scale, the return of movement to the battlefield, and, finally, an armistice. But it would also bring something unseen, something that killed more than bullets or shells, a pandemic. The story of 1918 is one of climax and catastrophe, of victory and plague, of an ending that was not really an end at all. The year 1918 began with a strange, uneasy mixture of hope and dread. After nearly 4 years of war, Europe was exhausted. Millions had been killed, wounded, or displaced. Fields lay barren, towns were shattered, and entire societies lived under the shadow of grief. And yet, for one side, there was still the belief that victory was within reach. Germany, freed from the burden of fighting Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, now faced only one great enemy, the Western Front. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, removed Russia from the war and gave Germany vast territories in the east. At last, German generals could transfer divisions westward. For a brief moment, the balance of power shifted in their favor. But the window was narrow. American troops were arriving, slowly at first, but in growing numbers. By late 1918, there would be over 2 million U.S. soldiers in France. Germany's leaders knew they had to strike before America's strength could tip the scales. And so began the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, known in English as the Spring Offensive. On March 21, 1918, German artillery opened fire with a massive bombardment. But unlike earlier barrages, this one was different. It was short, intense, and focused, designed to stun and disorient rather than obliterate. Then came stormtroopers, specially trained German infantry who moved quickly in small groups, bypassing strong points, infiltrating trenches, and sowing chaos behind enemy lines. At first, it worked brilliantly. The British Fifth Army reeled back. German forces advanced farther in days than they had in years. Towns and villages, long frozen in stalemate, were suddenly in German hands. Soldiers who had grown used to the immobility of trench warfare found themselves marching, advancing, seeing open country again. But success came at a cost. The stormtroopers moved too fast for supplies to keep up. Soldiers, hungry and exhausted, looted Allied depots for food and wine. Discipline frayed. And critically, the offensives failed to capture key strategic points, rail hubs, supply lines that might have broken the Allies' resistance. The Germans launched a series of hammer blows throughout the spring. Operation Michael, Operation Georgette, Operation Blucher. Each gained ground, each terrified the Allies, but none delivered the decisive knockout. By June, German forces were stretched thin, their best troops spent, their supplies dwindling. And then the tide turned. By summer, American troops were arriving in force. At the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918, German advances stalled. Allied counterattacks, reinforced by fresh U.S. divisions, pushed the Germans back. Morale on the German side crumbled. Soldiers muttered of defeat. Commanders began to admit privately that the war could not be won. In August, the Allies launched their own great offensive, the 100 Days Offensive. It began at Amiens on August 8th, a day German General Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. Allied tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked together in a coordinated assault. German lines broke. Unlike earlier battles, the Allies did not pause to consolidate. They pressed forward relentlessly, driving the Germans back week after week. The war of trenches was ending. Movement returned to the battlefield, but it was movement only in one direction: Germany in retreat. By September, the Allies breached the Hindenburg Line, Germany's last great defensive system. Town after town was liberated. The Central Powers collapsed one by one. Bulgaria surrendered in September, the Ottoman Empire in October, Austria-Hungary in early November. Germany stood alone. And inside Germany, the home front was falling apart. The British naval blockade had strangled supplies for years, leaving civilians hungry and desperate. Strikes and protests spread through cities. In the Navy, sailors mutinied rather than sail on a hopeless mission. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. The German monarchy was gone. 2 days later, on November 11th at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. An armistice had been signed. After 4 years, the Great War was over. The joy of peace was mixed with grief. The cost of the war was staggering. An estimated 10 million dead, 20 million wounded, millions more displaced. Entire towns had lost their young men. Fields across France and Belgium were cemeteries of white crosses. In Britain, France, and Germany, entire generations felt scarred. And yet, as if the war itself were not enough, 1918 brought another calamity, the influenza pandemic. The so-called Spanish flu swept the globe in 3 waves between 1918 and 1919. It infected perhaps a third of the world's population. Unlike most flus, which struck hardest at the very young and very old, this one killed healthy young adults, the very age group already decimated by war. Soldiers returning home carried the virus with them, spreading it to every corner of the world. In crowded barracks, trenches, and transport ships, it spread like wildfire. Estimates vary, but between 50 and 100 million people may have died, far more than the war itself. Villages in India lost entire populations. Cities in America and Europe saw morgues overflow. Families who had survived the war found themselves burying loved ones in the peace that followed. It was as if the world, already broken, was dealt one final cruel blow. And so, when people called the First World War the war to end all wars, it was not only a hope, it was a desperate plea. Humanity had endured horror upon horror: machine guns, gas, tanks, trenches, famine, and plague. Surely, many thought, there could never be another conflict like this again. Surely the sacrifice demanded by this war would buy a lasting peace. But history rarely grants such bargains. The armistice was only a pause. The peace treaties that followed, especially the Treaty of Versailles, would plant new seeds of bitterness and revenge. Within a generation, the world would once again be at war. For now, though, in November 1918, there was silence. Soldiers emerged from trenches and listened to the quiet, stunned that the guns had truly stopped. Civilians cheered, wept, embraced. Bells rang in churches, flags waved in streets. The war had ended, but the world it left behind was forever changed. The guns of November 11, 1918, had fallen silent, but the silence was not peace. It was something raw, stranger, a stunned quiet across a continent that had bled for 4 years. Soldiers stumbled out of trenches into the winter light, unsure whether to rejoice or to grieve. Families embraced survivors even as they mourned the dead. And across Europe, leaders gathered not only to mark the end of a war, but to decide what kind of world would follow. The First World War had done what centuries of diplomacy and conflict had not. It toppled empires. 4 great dynasties, pillars of old Europe, collapsed within months of each other. The Romanovs in Russia had already fallen in 1917, swept aside by revolution. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile in November 1918, and a new republic was proclaimed in Berlin. In Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg monarchy disintegrated. By the war's end, the empire had split into a patchwork of new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Yugoslavia. In the Ottoman Empire, defeat and occupation unraveled what remained of a centuries-old power, leaving behind turmoil and the stirrings of modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The age of empires was ending, but what replaced it was not stability. In Paris, beginning in January 1919, the victors gathered to craft a peace. The Paris Peace Conference was one of the largest diplomatic meetings in history, drawing delegates from around the globe. But at its heart were the Big Four: Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Each came with different goals. Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, demanded harsh terms to ensure Germany could never again threaten France. Lloyd George balanced between punishing Germany and preserving its strength as a buffer against Bolshevik Russia. Orlando pressed for Italian territorial claims, including promises made in secret wartime treaties. And Wilson, with his 14 points, envisioned a new order based on self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But lofty ideals collided with bitter realities. The most famous treaty to emerge was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. Its terms shocked Germany. The nation was forced to accept full responsibility for the war in the so-called War Guilt Clause. Reparations, financial payments to the Allies, were imposed on a scale that crippled the German economy. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men. Its navy was limited, its air force abolished. Territories were stripped away. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, land ceded to the new nations of Poland, Belgium, and Denmark. Overseas colonies were seized by the victors. For Germans, Versailles felt less like peace and more like humiliation. Politicians who signed the treaty were branded the November criminals. The resentment seeded in 1919 would fester for decades, feeding extremist movements and setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe. But Germany was not the only nation reshaped. The map of Europe was redrawn dramatically. New countries emerged from the wreckage of empires. Poland, restored after more than a century of partition. Czechoslovakia, combining Czechs and Slovaks under one flag. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, forging a fragile unity from the Balkans. These new states were born from Wilson's promise of self-determination, but reality was messy. Ethnic minorities often found themselves trapped in new borders where they were not the majority. In Eastern Europe, tensions simmered. Poles against Ukrainians, Hungarians against Romanians, Serbs against Croats. The seeds of future conflict lay in those new lines. Beyond Europe, the war had global consequences. The Ottoman territories in the Middle East were carved up into mandates administered by Britain and France. Palestine, Syria, Iraq. Promises made to Arabs for independence during the war clashed with promises made to Zionists for a Jewish homeland, and with secret agreements between allies. The result was a tangled legacy of mistrust and conflict that still echoes a century later. In Asia, Japan emerged stronger, having seized German colonies in the Pacific and parts of China. In Africa, colonies shifted hands among the victors, but the lives of the colonized changed little. For many across the colonial world, the war raised expectations of freedom, expectations soon disappointed. At home, societies reeled from loss. In France, almost every village had a memorial to its fallen sons. In Britain, fields of poppies bloomed where trenches had been, immortalized in John McCrae's haunting poem, In Flanders Fields. In Germany, veterans returned to a society in chaos, struggling with poverty, inflation, and political extremism. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution had unleashed civil war, famine, and foreign intervention. And then there was the Spanish flu, the silent shadow of 1918 to 1919. It did not respect borders, treaties, or ceasefires. It struck civilians and soldiers alike, killing more than the war itself. In the ruins of Europe, where hunger and poverty were rampant, the pandemic deepened suffering. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," lingered in speeches and newspapers. Wilson, in particular, clung to it, believing the League of Nations could enforce a new kind of international order. In 1920, the League was founded, intended as a forum for nations to resolve disputes peacefully. But without the United States, whose Senate rejected joining, it lacked power. Ambition and hope collided once again with the realities of politics. For ordinary people, the war left deep marks. Women, who had entered factories and hospitals in unprecedented numbers, found new roles and new confidence, though many were pushed back into traditional roles after 1918. In some countries, such as Britain and the United States, women gained the right to vote soon after the war. For workers, the sacrifices of wartime fed demands for fairer wages and conditions. For veterans, adjusting to civilian life was often painful. Some bore visible wounds, others invisible scars. Shell shock, amputations, disfigurement. These were part of everyday life in post-war Europe. The cultural memory of the war was complex. Some saw it as a tragic waste, others as a necessary sacrifice. Monuments rose in every city, cenotaphs and tombs of the unknown soldier. Writers and poets grappled with meaning. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, published in 1929, captured the futility and trauma from a German soldier's perspective. In Britain, poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen gave voice to anger and grief. The war had changed the world, but had it ended war itself? That question haunted the 1920s. Leaders spoke of peace, but borders were fragile, economies unstable, and politics volatile. The Great War had ended, but its shadow stretched forward, shaping the decades to come. For now, in 1919, the people of Europe stood amid ruins, cathedrals shelled, fields cratered, villages gone. They planted poppies and rebuilt homes. They buried the dead and tried to imagine a future. And in that silence after the storm, many dared to believe the promise that such a war could never come again. But history, as we know, had other plans. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world dreamed of peace. In Paris, at the signing of treaties, leaders spoke of a new era where nations would no longer solve disputes with bloodshed. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," echoed through speeches, newspapers, and sermons. For millions who had sacrificed everything, it had to be true. The alternative was unthinkable. And yet, as the 1920s and 1930s unfolded, it became clear that the peace of 1919 was fragile, flawed, and doomed to unravel. The war that had been meant to end all wars had, in fact, laid the foundation for another, even more destructive conflict. Let us begin with the Treaty of Versailles itself. For Germany, Versailles was not just a treaty, it was a wound. The war guilt clause placed full responsibility for the conflict on German shoulders. Reparations demanded billions of marks in payments. Territories were stripped away. Alsace-Lorraine to France, Polish territories to the east, colonies overseas carved up among the victors. The German military was reduced to a shadow of its former self, forbidden tanks, aircraft, or submarines. To the Allies, these measures seemed fair, even mild, compared to the devastation wrought by Germany's armies. But to ordinary Germans, Versailles was a humiliation, a national shame. The phrase Diktat, a dictated peace, became common. Veterans returned home to parades of bitterness, not honor. Extremist groups seized on this anger, arguing that Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by traitors, Jews, and communists at home. This poisonous myth would become central to the rise of Nazism. Economics deepened the wound. Germany struggled to pay reparations, its economy staggering under debt. In 1923, hyperinflation spiraled out of control. The value of the German mark collapsed. Workers were paid in wheelbarrows of cash. Savings vanished overnight. People used banknotes as wallpaper or fuel. Families who had been secure fell into ruin. The crisis stabilized briefly with international loans, particularly the Dawes Plan in 1924, but the underlying fragility remained. And when the global economy crashed in 1929 with the Great Depression, Germany collapsed again. Mass unemployment, hunger, and despair created fertile ground for extremists promising revival, revenge, and order. Elsewhere in Europe, the promises of Versailles also bred discontent. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated. Italian leaders had been promised territories along the Adriatic and in the Middle East, but much of it went to others. The phrase, "a mutilated victory," haunted Italian politics, fueling nationalism and, eventually, the rise of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. In Eastern Europe, the new nations born from empire, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, struggled with ethnic tensions and fragile borders. Wilson's dream of self-determination proved impossible to satisfy in lands where peoples were intermingled. Minorities felt excluded, majorities felt threatened, and grievances simmered. Beyond Europe, the settlement sowed other seeds of unrest. In the Middle East, Arab leaders who had fought with Allied promises of independence saw their lands divided into mandates controlled by Britain and France. In Asia, Japan, which had gained territory from Germany, felt slighted when its proposal for a racial equality clause was rejected at Versailles. Across colonies in Africa and Asia, millions who had served in the war hoped for freedom, only to find imperial rule unchanged. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope, was meant to address these grievances and prevent future wars. It was a noble idea, a council where disputes would be resolved by dialogue, not arms. But the League was crippled from birth. The United States, ironically, never joined. The Senate in Washington rejected it, wary of entangling America in foreign conflicts. Without American power, the League lacked teeth. When crises erupted in the 1920s and 1930s, Japan invading Manchuria, Italy invading Germany, rearming, the League protested, passed resolutions, but did nothing effective. Meanwhile, societies themselves were haunted. The lost generation of young men who had survived the trenches carried invisible scars. Shell shock, amputations, disfigurement, these became common sights. Writers captured the mood. Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front painted the war as meaningless slaughter. In Britain, poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen turned bitterly against the old rhetoric of glory. Across the world, a cultural shift took place. Cynicism, disillusionment, and the sense that something in Western civilization had shattered. Yet, paradoxically, the 1920s also shimmered with vitality. The war had accelerated change. Women in many countries gained the right to vote. They cut their hair short, entered the workforce in greater numbers, and challenged traditional roles. Technology leapt forward. Automobiles, radios, cinema. Jazz filled smoky clubs. Cities pulsed with energy. The roaring 20s felt, for a moment, like liberation from the shadows of war. But the shadow never fully lifted. Beneath the surface, instability grew. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party rose from obscurity, fueled by promises to overturn Versailles, restore pride, and rebuild strength. At first, dismissed as fringe, they gained followers in the chaos of the Depression. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. Within years, Germany rearmed openly, violating Versailles, while the League of Nations watched helplessly. In Italy, Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, establishing a fascist dictatorship that glorified war and conquest. In Japan, militarists seized power, pushing expansion in Asia. In Spain, civil war erupted in the 1930s, drawing in fascists and communists alike, a grim rehearsal for the global war to come. The very phrase, "the war to end all wars," began to sound bitterly ironic. For the generation that had survived Verdun and the Somme, it was heartbreaking to watch the world sliding back toward the abyss. By the late 1930s, the lessons of 1914 seemed forgotten. Appeasement, rearmament, propaganda, all the old patterns returned, with new weapons and ideologies. And in 1939, just 2 decades after the supposed Peace of Versailles, the world once again plunged into war, this time even larger, even more devastating. Looking back, it is easy to say the First World War failed in its promise. It did not end war. But perhaps the truth is more complex. For millions at the time, calling it the war to end all wars was not prophecy, but prayer. It was a hope that sacrifice had meaning, that humanity might learn. The tragedy is not that they were naive, but that the world proved them right only in their despair. The Great War reshaped the 20th century. It destroyed empires, redrew maps, and unleashed ideologies that would dominate decades. It left a legacy of remembrance, poppies, memorials, cenotaphs that still speaks today. And it left us with the haunting reminder that wars are never truly ended by treaties alone. They linger in memory, in resentment, in the wounds of nations and people. In the end, the First World War was both. The war to end all wars and the war that made future wars possible. A paradox carved in stone, written in blood, and carried forward by every generation that remembers. The First World War ended more than a century ago, but its shadows still fall across our world today. To understand why, we must look beyond the battlefields and treaties, beyond the numbers of dead and the maps redrawn, and ask what truly remained when the guns went silent. The war did not simply reshape borders. It reshaped culture, memory, and the very way people thought about war, peace, and human existence. Its legacy seeped into art, literature, politics, and daily life. And it continues to whisper in how nations remember and how we tell stories about the past. Let us begin with memory. In the aftermath of the war, communities across Europe and beyond faced the unimaginable task of honoring their dead. Almost every village in France, Britain, and Germany built a memorial, often inscribed with the names of young men who had never returned. Families who had no grave to visit because so many bodies were lost in the mud of the Western Front found solace in cenotaphs and tombs of the unknown soldier. The unknown soldier became a universal symbol. In 1920, France interred one beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, Britain beneath the floor of Westminster Abbey in London. The United States followed in 1921 at Arlington National Cemetery. These tombs were not just graves, but sacred spaces, places where entire nations could grieve. They embodied both the anonymity of modern war and the collective sacrifice of millions. Each year, on Armistice Day, November 11th, people paused for 2 minutes of silence. Poppies, inspired by John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, became symbols of remembrance, small, red, and fragile, like the lives lost. To this day, they are worn in Britain and the Commonwealth each November, reminders that the memory of the Great War never truly faded. But remembrance was not uniform. For some, the war was framed as noble sacrifice. For others, it was meaningless slaughter. The tension between these interpretations became one of the defining cultural debates of the 20th century. In literature, the war produced an outpouring of voices. The soldier poets of Britain, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, captured both the patriotism and the disillusionment. Owen's Dulce et decorum est ripped apart the old rhetoric of glory, showing instead the choking horror of gas warfare. Sassoon's bitter lines mocked the empty promises of politicians and generals. Their works shaped how generations would view the war, not as gallant adventure, but as tragedy. In Germany, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front told the story of the war from the perspective of ordinary German soldiers. Published in 1929, it was a sensation read around the world. Its bleak portrayal of disillusioned youth, crushed by the machinery of war, resonated far beyond Germany. The book was banned and burned by the Nazis, who despised its pacifist message, but its power endured. Art also changed. The pre-war optimism of Impressionism and Romanticism gave way to stark new movements: Expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism. Painters like Otto Dix depicted shattered soldiers and scarred landscapes with brutal honesty. The old idea that art should be beautiful seemed hollow after the trenches. Instead, art became a way to grapple with trauma, to capture the fractured nature of modern life. The war also transformed societies. Women who had taken on roles in factories, offices, and hospitals proved indispensable to the war effort. After 1918, many nations granted women the right to vote. Britain in 1918, for women over 30, extended in 1928, the United States in 1920, and others soon after. While progress was uneven and often rolled back, the war accelerated social change, planting seeds of greater equality. Technology, too, leapt forward. The war had spurred innovations in aviation, medicine, and communication. Blood transfusions, plastic surgery, and prosthetics advanced rapidly in response to battlefield needs. Airplanes, once fragile novelties, became engines of reconnaissance and combat. Radio spread information faster than ever. These technologies did not disappear with peace. They shaped civilian life in the 1920s and beyond. But perhaps the deepest legacy was psychological. The term shell shock entered the vocabulary, describing men who returned broken in mind as well as body. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1918, it was poorly understood, often stigmatized. Still, it marked a recognition that war wounds could be invisible, that the mind could shatter under strain. For nations, too, the war left invisible wounds. In France, victory came at terrible cost. An entire generation decimated, towns destroyed. The French built a culture of remembrance centered on sacrifice and resilience. In Britain, the war was remembered as both glory and tragedy, shaping national identity for decades. In Germany, the memory was poisoned by humiliation and bitterness, exploited by extremists to fuel new conflict. Even in places far from the Western Front, the war's echoes resounded. In the Middle East, new borders created tensions that persist to this day. In colonies across Africa and Asia, veterans returned with new ideas, questioning why they had fought for freedoms denied to them at home. Movements for independence gained momentum, fueled in part by the disillusionment of war. The war also altered how people thought about the very concept of war. Before 1914, many Europeans still spoke of war as noble, cleansing, a proving ground for nations. After 1918, that illusion was shattered. The sheer scale of slaughter, the sight of modern machines tearing bodies apart, made it impossible to see war as anything but mechanized horror. The phrase, "never again," was whispered across Europe, even as preparations for future conflicts quietly resumed. The irony of the war to end all wars lies in this tension. The phrase captured a desperate hope, a longing for meaning and sacrifice. And in some ways, the war did change humanity's relationship with war. It birthed international institutions like the League of Nations, early attempts at collective security. It spurred treaties to ban chemical weapons, to regulate arms. It left a deep cultural imprint warning of war's futility. But the hope was incomplete. Nationalism, resentment, and ideology proved stronger than memory. By the 1930s, the world was marching once again toward catastrophe. And yet, the First World War remains distinct in memory. It is remembered not only for its scale, but for its character. The trenches, the poetry, the sense of a world losing innocence. It marked the end of an age, the twilight of aristocratic Europe, the birth of modernity. Even today, standing at Verdun, the Somme, or Ypres, one feels the weight of that legacy. The cemeteries stretch to the horizon, crosses and stars of David in neat rows, each one a life cut short. The silence of those fields is heavy, not only with grief, but with warning. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the First World War. It did not end war, but it changed how we remember war, how we speak of it, how we carry it in culture and memory. It left us with symbols, the poppy, the unknown soldier, the 2 minutes of silence, that remind us not to forget. And though the promise of the war to end all wars was broken, the hope within it remains. A hope that history, even at its darkest, can teach us. A hope that sacrifice is not entirely in vain if it leaves behind memory, wisdom, and a warning to the future. The First World War is often remembered as tragedy, futility, and waste. But beyond the grief and horror, it also became a kind of teacher, though one whose lessons were only partly understood. If we listen closely, the echoes of 1914-1918 still reach us today, whispering warnings, urging reflection. Some lessons were embraced, others ignored, and some remain contested even now. Let us begin with the most obvious, the cost of underestimating war. Before 1914, many leaders believed that modern war would be short, swift, perhaps even cleansing. They thought industry and railways would deliver quick victories. They underestimated the power of machine guns, artillery, and trenches. They misjudged how nationalism, pride, and alliances would turn a regional crisis into a world conflagration. The result was catastrophe on a scale no one expected. The lesson here was simple: never assume war will be easy, or that it will be over quickly. Yet, history shows how often this mistake has been repeated. In 1939, in later wars across the 20th and 21st centuries. The Great War's first lesson is a warning against hubris. Another lesson lies in alliances. The complex web of treaties before 1914 was meant to deter war, but instead it trapped nations into fighting whether they wished to or not. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, alliances dragged in Germany, Russia, France, and Britain within days. The conflict spiraled because no one could step back without appearing weak. This lesson, that alliances can entangle as much as they protect, remains relevant. Today's global security pacts and mutual defense treaties echo those of the past. They offer strength and unity, but also risk escalation if crises are not managed carefully. Then there is the lesson of peace itself. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to end the war, instead sowed the seeds of another. By humiliating Germany, imposing crushing reparations, and redrawing borders without fully addressing ethnic realities, the treaty left resentment and instability. A peace built on punishment rather than reconciliation proved fragile. Here the lesson is stark. Peace must not only end conflict, but also build foundations for stability. Without justice and fairness, peace becomes only a pause between wars. The war also revealed the power and the danger of technology. Machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons transformed battlefields. But technology did not shorten the war or make it more decisive. Instead, it prolonged slaughter. The lesson is not that technology alone decides victory, but that without wisdom and restraint, it can magnify destruction. Today, as humanity develops ever more powerful weapons, nuclear arms, cyber warfare, drones, the echoes of 1914 remind us that innovation without foresight can lead to disaster. Another profound lesson lies in the human mind. The war exposed how fragile soldiers were under constant strain. Shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, was a revelation. For centuries, war trauma had been dismissed as cowardice or weakness. But the Great War forced recognition that the human spirit has limits. This lesson reshaped medicine, psychology, and our understanding of veterans. Yet it also taught us something larger, that war's damage lingers long after the guns fall silent. It lives in memories, in nightmares, in societies fractured by loss. The lesson here is that the cost of war cannot be measured only in battles won or treaties signed, but in generations scarred. The Great War also left behind lessons in democracy and society. In its wake, monarchies fell, republics rose, and new voices demanded recognition. Women who had worked in factories and hospitals gained greater rights. Workers who had sacrificed in mines and fields pressed for fairer wages and conditions. Colonized peoples who had fought under imperial flags began to demand independence. The war thus revealed a truth, that total war transforms societies from top to bottom. Once people have sacrificed everything, they will not return quietly to old hierarchies. The lesson for leaders is clear. War alters the social contract, sometimes in ways no government can fully control. Yet perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is about memory itself. The First World War was branded the war to end all wars. It was a phrase born of hope, grief, and desperation. And yet, within a generation, the world plunged into an even greater war. Why? Because memory is fragile, lessons fade. Nationalism, pride, ideology, these forces can overwhelm remembrance. The warning here is timeless. Memory must be preserved actively. If history is forgotten, its mistakes return. That is why cemeteries, monuments, poems, and books matter. They are not relics, but reminders. They carry the voices of the dead to the living. And what of our own time? The world of the 21st century is not the world of 1914, but echoes remain. Alliances still bind nations. Nationalism still stirs hearts. Technology still promises both progress and peril. And wars, though different in shape, still erupt, sometimes from miscalculation, sometimes from pride, sometimes from the failure of peace. To call the First World War the war to end all wars was, in one sense, a mistake. But in another sense, it was a plea. It was humanity crying out, begging that such horror never be repeated. The tragedy is that the plea was ignored. The hope is that we might still hear it now. So what is the final lesson? Perhaps it is humility. The First World War teaches us that human beings are capable of building machines and systems of unimaginable power, but we are also capable of unleashing destruction we cannot control. It teaches us that war is not glorious, but brutal and senseless. It teaches us that peace is fragile, requiring constant care, fairness, and memory. And maybe above all, it teaches us that hope, even when broken, still matters. For even in the trenches, amid mud and gas and shell fire, soldiers wrote letters, sang songs, shared laughter. They dreamed of home. They dreamed of a better world. And though their dream was betrayed by history, it still lives in us whenever we whisper, "Never again." The First World War did not end war, but it gave us the chance to see war clearly, without illusion. And in that clarity lies our choice, to repeat the past or to learn from it. The First World War did not only change borders, governments, or armies. It changed the very fabric of culture, art, and thought. After 4 years of slaughter, people struggled to make sense of what had happened. Old certainties, the belief in progress, the faith in honor and glory, the trust in leaders were shattered. And in their place arose a new voice, disillusioned, questioning, searching for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its way. This generation became known as the Lost Generation. The phrase, popularized by writer Gertrude Stein and later by Ernest Hemingway, captured the sense of dislocation felt by those who had come of age during the war. They had marched off to battle filled with youthful idealism, only to return scarred, broken, or haunted by memories of mud and death. Many never returned at all. Those who did often felt alienated from the societies that sent them to fight. In literature, this alienation found powerful expression. Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, published in 1929, drew directly from his experiences as an ambulance driver in Italy. Its terse, stripped-down style reflected the harsh realities of war, where romantic illusions gave way to brutal survival. Scott Fitzgerald, another member of the Lost Generation, explored the emptiness and excess of the post-war world in The Great Gatsby, a novel haunted by themes of disillusionment beneath glittering surfaces. In Britain, writers like Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon turned their experiences into memoirs that laid bare the futility of war and the hypocrisy of leaders. Sassoon's biting satire and Owen's haunting poetry stripped away the rhetoric of patriotism, exposing instead the mud, gas, and wasted youth. Art, too, changed. The horror of the trenches gave rise to new movements that broke violently with tradition. Dadaism, born in Zurich during the war, rejected logic, reason, and aesthetic norms. For Dadaists like Tristan Tzara and Marcel Duchamp, the war had revealed the absurdity of a world governed by reason and order. Their art embraced chaos, nonsense, and provocation, reflecting the madness they saw around them. Surrealism, emerging in the 1920s, pushed further, exploring dreams, the unconscious, and irrational juxtapositions. Artists like Salvador Dalí and Max Ernst sought to capture the hidden depths of the human psyche, as if to make sense of the trauma through imagination rather than reason. In Germany, expressionist artists such as Otto Dix and George Gross painted nightmarish visions of mutilated veterans, corrupt politicians, and urban decay. Dix's series Der Krieg, The War, presented unflinching images of corpses, skeletons, and shattered landscapes. These works were not simply art. They were accusations, indictments of a society that had allowed mass slaughter. Philosophy, too, shifted. The optimism of the 19th century, belief in progress, in rational order, was replaced by darker reflections. Thinkers like Oswald Spengler wrote of decline and collapse, arguing in The Decline of the West that civilizations rise and fall in cycles, and that Europe's time was ending. Others, like existentialists in the decades that followed, wrestled with questions of meaning in a world that seemed devoid of certainty. Even religion felt the strain. Faith that had once comforted millions seemed shaken by the scale of suffering. Some turned away, seeking solace in new ideologies, communism, fascism, nationalism, that promised clarity and renewal. Others sought spiritual answers in more personal, less institutional ways, reflecting the fractured state of the post-war soul. But not all was despair. The cultural ferment of the post-war years also produced vibrancy, experimentation, and a sense of breaking free from the past. The Roaring Twenties, with its jazz, cinema, and modernist architecture, was a rebellion against the darkness. It was as if a generation, scarred by war, refused to be bound by old rules. In Paris, expatriates gathered in cafes, writing, painting, debating. James Joyce published Ulysses in 1922, a stream of consciousness novel that revolutionized literature. T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, also in 1922, captured the fragmentation of post-war culture with haunting lines about broken images and lost meaning. Virginia Woolf explored consciousness and identity in new experimental forms. Cinema, too, flourished as a new art form. Silent films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari reflected the anxieties of a society grappling with madness and authority. Later, sound brought new power to storytelling, with films exploring themes of war, trauma, and escape. Music changed as well. Jazz, born in African American communities, spread across the Atlantic, electrifying European audiences. Its improvisation and energy symbolized both freedom and disorientation. In classical music, composers like Stravinsky, Schoenberg, and Bartók shattered old tonal traditions, creating sounds that mirrored the turbulence of the age. Even daily life carried the war's imprint. Fashion shifted dramatically. Women cut their hair into bobs, wore shorter skirts, and embraced more active roles in society. Men who had survived the front often bore physical scars, missing limbs, disfigured faces, that became part of the landscape of post-war Europe. The presence of veterans, both visible and invisible, was a constant reminder that life could never fully return to what it had been. And yet, through all this cultural upheaval, the question lingered: what had it all meant? For many, the answer was bitter. The war had been fought with the promise of ending war, yet within 2 decades another even more devastating conflict erupted. The disillusionment of the lost generation deepened. Their works read not as isolated reflections, but as warnings ignored. But perhaps another answer lies in resilience. The very outpouring of art, literature, and thought was itself a form of survival. Humanity had been plunged into darkness, and yet it sought to express, to understand, to remember. In the shattered landscapes of the Western Front, poppies grew. In the fractured culture of the 1920s, creativity bloomed. Out of despair came voices that still speak to us today. The cultural legacy of the First World War, then, is not only about what was lost, but also about how people tried to make meaning from loss. It is about how trauma reshaped creativity, how disillusionment gave birth to modernism, how silence was broken by art that refused to look away. And perhaps in those voices, poets, painters, philosophers, we find something the politicians and generals could not give. Not the end of war, but a clearer understanding of its cost, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, expression is a form of endurance. When we think of the First World War, our minds often turn to the mud of Flanders, the trenches of the Somme, or the ruins of Verdun. But the Great War was never just a European conflict. It was the first truly global war, and its echoes stretched far beyond the Western Front. From the deserts of the Middle East to the forests of Africa, from the ports of Asia to the islands of the Pacific, the war reshaped the world. Its consequences are still visible today in borders, politics, and struggles that trace their roots back to 1914 to 1918. Let us begin in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, once a mighty power, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. For centuries, it had ruled vast territories across the Middle East, but by 1914, it was already known as the sick man of Europe. The war accelerated its collapse. British forces fought the Ottomans in campaigns stretching from Mesopotamia to Palestine. In 1917, British troops captured Baghdad. In December, they marched into Jerusalem, greeted with both awe and suspicion. At the same time, Arab leaders launched their own revolt against Ottoman rule. Encouraged by promises from Britain, most famously through correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, they dreamed of creating a unified Arab kingdom. British officer T.E. Lawrence, later immortalized as Lawrence of Arabia, worked alongside Arab fighters, leading raids across the desert. Their victories were real, their hopes sincere. But behind the scenes, the Allies made secret agreements. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the Middle East into spheres of influence for Britain and France. Promises to Arabs clashed with promises made to Zionists in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported a Jewish homeland in Palestine. When the war ended, Arab hopes were dashed. Instead of independence, the region was carved into mandates under British and French control. Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon. The legacy of these decisions is profound. The borders drawn in 1919, 1920, often with little regard for ethnic or religious realities, continue to fuel tensions today. The seeds of many modern Middle Eastern conflicts were planted in the aftermath of the Great War. In Africa, too, the war reshaped colonial rule. Both sides drew heavily on African soldiers and laborers. The French recruited hundreds of thousands from West Africa. Britain drew troops from Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. Germany, which had colonies in East Africa, Cameroon, and Southwest Africa, found them drawn into the struggle. In East Africa, German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a guerrilla campaign that tied down Allied forces for years, making it one of the longest-running theaters of the war. For Africans, the experience was double-edged. Service in the war brought new skills, new perspectives, and sometimes new opportunities. But it also exposed the brutality of colonial rule and the hypocrisy of empires that demanded sacrifice abroad while denying rights at home. After 1918, veterans returned with questions. Why had they fought for freedom in Europe while living under foreign domination? Across the continent, the seeds of anti-colonial movements began to sprout, movements that would grow stronger in the decades to come. In Asia, the war had equally far-reaching effects. Japan, allied with Britain, seized German possessions in the Pacific and China. It presented itself as a rising power, expecting recognition. But at Versailles, Japan's proposal for a racial equality clause was rejected, largely by Britain and Australia. The insult stung, fueling resentment and shaping Japan's path toward militarism in the 1930s. In China, the war inspired both hope and anger. Chinese laborers were recruited to dig trenches and work behind the lines in Europe. China sent delegations to Versailles, expecting German concessions in Shandong to be returned. Instead, those territories were handed to Japan. Outrage erupted in the May 4th movement of 1919, a wave of protests that reshaped Chinese politics and gave momentum to both nationalism and the early communist movement. India, then part of the British Empire, contributed massively to the war effort. Over 1 million soldiers fought overseas, from the Western Front to Mesopotamia. Many hoped their service would lead to greater autonomy or even independence. Instead, reforms were limited, and disillusionment grew. The Amritsar Massacre of 1919, where British troops fired on unarmed Indian protesters, deepened anger. The war thus became a turning point in India's independence struggle, strengthening the movement led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi. In the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand, small nations far from Europe, suffered heavy casualties at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. The war became central to their national identities. Anzac Day, commemorating the landing at Gallipoli on April 25, remains one of the most important national holidays in both countries. For many, the war was the moment when these young nations stepped out from under the shadow of Britain, defining themselves through sacrifice and endurance. Even in Latin America, though far from the battlefields, the war had consequences. Countries like Brazil eventually entered the war on the Allied side, while others supplied resources. The economic disruptions of the conflict altered trade patterns, weakening European dominance and strengthening ties with the United States. Truly, the war was global, and its global consequences were as enduring as those in Europe. It left behind new borders in the Middle East, new grievances in Asia, new stirrings of independence in Africa and India, new national identities in places like Australia and New Zealand. It weakened old empires, empowered new powers, and revealed the hypocrisy of colonialism. It showed that the age of European dominance was not eternal, that the world was shifting toward a new, more complex order. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the war's global reach is that no corner of the world is untouched by such conflicts. In 1914, few in Africa, Asia, or the Pacific could have imagined that their fates would be bound up in a quarrel between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Yet by 1918, millions outside Europe had fought, suffered, and died for that quarrel. The First World War proved once and for all that the world was interconnected, that a spark in Sarajevo could ignite fires across the globe. And in that realization lay both hope and danger. Hope because humanity might see itself as one world, bound together. Danger because it meant that when war came, it would no longer be confined. The Great War was the war of empires, but it was also the war that began their unraveling. It showed the cracks in colonial rule, the stirrings of independence, the emergence of new powers. In this way, the war to end all wars was also the war that began a new age, the age of global transformation. History is often told through battles and treaties, through numbers and maps. But behind those events stand people, leaders, soldiers, thinkers, and artists whose choices and voices shaped how the First World War was fought and how it is remembered. To understand the war's legacy, we must meet some of these figures, not as distant names, but as human beings who carried the weight of decisions, dreams, and despair. Let us begin with the leaders. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany looms large at the war's beginning. Impulsive, ambitious, and insecure, Wilhelm dismissed the cautious diplomacy of Bismarck and pushed Germany onto a path of rivalry with Britain and France. He believed in Germany's destiny as a world power, building a navy to rival the Royal Navy and embracing a policy of aggression. Yet, when war came, Wilhelm often vacillated, leaving strategy to his generals. By 1918, his authority had crumbled. The Kaiser fled into exile in the Netherlands, his empire gone. His legacy is one of squandered power, a man whose restlessness helped ignite catastrophe. Across the Channel, Britain was led first by Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, then by David Lloyd George. Asquith was hesitant, often paralyzed by indecision, and eventually replaced in 1916. Lloyd George, energetic and shrewd, guided Britain through the latter half of the war, balancing military needs with political pressures. He was a master of rhetoric, presenting the war as a struggle for civilization itself. Yet he also bore responsibility for the harsh peace terms at Versailles, decisions that shaped the next generation's conflicts. In France, Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger, embodied resilience. He came to power in 1917 when France was reeling from mutinies and despair. Clemenceau's determination was uncompromising. Fight on until victory. He demanded retribution at Versailles, driven by the devastation France had endured. His sternness gave France strength, but also ensured that peace carried bitterness. In the United States, Woodrow Wilson entered the war late but left a profound mark. He framed America's entry not as vengeance, but as a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy. His 14 points envisioned a new international order, with self-determination for nations and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Wilson's vision was idealistic, almost prophetic. But at home, his Senate rejected the League, and abroad, his ideas collided with the realities of European politics. Wilson left office broken, his dream unfulfilled. Yet his vision continues to influence debates about international cooperation even today. On the battlefield, generals became both famous and infamous. In Germany, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff rose to prominence after victories on the Eastern Front. They effectively took control of German strategy by 1916, turning the country into a virtual military dictatorship. Their decision to launch the 1918 Spring Offensive was bold but ultimately doomed, exhausting Germany's last reserves. After defeat, Hindenburg and Ludendorff propagated the stab-in-the-back myth, blaming politicians for surrender. This lie poisoned German politics and fed the rise of Hitler. In France, General Philippe Pétain became a hero of Verdun, known for his calm leadership and care for soldiers. His order, "They shall not pass," symbolized French resilience. Yet his later career during the Second World War cast a shadow over his legacy when he led the collaborationist Vichy regime. In Britain, figures like Field Marshal Douglas Haig commanded immense armies. Haig led at the Somme and Passchendaele, battles that became symbols of futility. Critics accused him of being indifferent to casualties, the so-called butcher of the Somme. Yet defenders argue he adapted to the realities of industrial war and helped deliver victory in 1918. His legacy remains fiercely debated, reflecting the complexity of leadership in a war where every choice meant death for thousands. But not all the important figures wore crowns or uniforms. Many of the most enduring voices of the war were those of writers and poets who tried to capture its essence. Wilfred Owen, a young British officer, wrote poems that remain among the most powerful testaments of the war. His lines, drawn from the gas-filled trenches and shattered landscapes, stripped away illusions of honor. He died in action just a week before the armistice, but his poetry lives on, giving voice to a generation silenced too soon. Siegfried Sassoon, another British officer, combined biting satire with haunting imagery. He openly criticized the war's leadership, even publishing a statement of protest in 1917. Yet he returned to the front, torn between loyalty to his men and his disillusionment with the cause. His words helped shape the modern image of the war as futile and tragic. In Germany, Erich Maria Remarque gave the world All Quiet on the Western Front. His novel, written a decade after the war, portrayed ordinary soldiers ground down by mud, terror, and disillusionment. It was a sensation worldwide, banned by the Nazis but embraced by millions. For many readers, it remains the definitive story of the soldier's experience. Even in the United States, which entered the war late, writers like Ernest Hemingway drew on wartime experiences to shape their style. Hemingway's terse, stripped prose reflected the hard truths of a generation that had seen too much. There were also figures of courage far from the limelight. Edith Cavell, a British nurse in German-occupied Belgium, helped Allied soldiers escape. She was executed by the Germans in 1915, and her story became a rallying cry, symbolizing both sacrifice and cruelty. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, became a legend through his role in the Arab Revolt. His exploits, mixing diplomacy, guerrilla warfare, and myth-making, captured the imagination. Yet Lawrence himself was deeply conflicted, aware of the betrayals behind the promises made to the Arabs. These individuals, leaders, generals, poets, nurses, rebels, represent the human dimension of the war. They remind us that history is not abstract. It is lived by people making choices in impossible circumstances. Some sought glory, others sought survival. Some left legacies of wisdom, others of destruction. And in their stories, we see the paradox of the First World War. Leaders who dreamed of glory unleashed chaos. Generals who sought victory found themselves presiding over slaughter. Poets who despised war gave it its most enduring voice. Ordinary men and women, caught in forces beyond their control, became symbols of resilience, sacrifice, and disillusionment. Perhaps that is why the First World War still fascinates us. It is not only the scale of the conflict, but the humanity within it, the voices that speak across time, warning us, moving us, reminding us. The war to end all wars did not succeed in ending war, but through the people who lived it, we inherit its memory, and perhaps, if we listen, its lessons. Wars are often remembered through battles, generals, and treaties, but most people who lived through the First World War were not soldiers on the front lines. They were farmers, factory workers, mothers, children, students, and shopkeepers. Their daily lives were transformed by a conflict that reached into every home, every kitchen, every field. To understand the war fully, we must look at it not only through the trenches, but also through the hearth and the marketplace. Let us begin in the countryside of Europe. In 1914, many imagined the war would be short. Farmers planted their fields, believing they would harvest as usual. But by 1915, millions of young men had been conscripted, leaving villages emptied of their strongest workers. The burden of agriculture fell on women, the elderly, and even children. Horses, essential for plowing and transport, were requisitioned for the army. Fertilizer, diverted to explosives, grew scarce. The result was declining harvests at the very moment armies demanded more food. In France, the war was fought on farmland itself. Villages near the front were destroyed, fields cratered, orchards cut down. Families fled, becoming refugees within their own country. Even in safer regions, shortages bit deeply. Bread was rationed, meat became a luxury. Yet French civilians endured, driven by patriotism and necessity, carrying on with the motto tenir, to hold on. In Germany, the Allied blockade made shortages far worse. Imported food and fertilizer were cut off. By 1916-1917, hunger was widespread. The turnip winter of 1917 became infamous when potatoes failed and people survived on turnips meant for livestock. Malnutrition weakened the population, especially children, leaving scars for decades. German civilians, once promised quick victory, now stood in breadlines, their faith in leaders crumbling. In Britain, the blockade worked in reverse. Britain was vulnerable to German U-boats sinking supply ships. By 1917, the nation faced crisis. Food rationing was introduced, urging citizens to eat less bread and more vegetables, to plant gardens, to avoid waste. Posters proclaimed, "Eat less bread," and "Victory is in the kitchen." Women in rural areas joined the land army, working the fields to replace men gone to war. Daily life in cities was equally transformed. Factories shifted from civilian goods to war production. Women entered the workforce in numbers never seen before, building shells, assembling aircraft, producing uniforms. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions. Explosions at munitions plants killed hundreds. Their skin was sometimes stained yellow from handling TNT, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Yet their labor was essential, and it challenged traditional gender roles. Children, too, were part of the war effort. They collected scrap metal, paper, and bones for reuse. They helped in fields, ran errands, and endured air raids. In London, German Zeppelin bombers brought war from the front lines to civilian homes. People huddled in basements as bombs fell, the first time in history that cities were attacked from the air. The raids caused relatively few casualties compared to later wars, but the psychological shock was immense. No place felt truly safe. In occupied territories, life could be brutal. In Belgium and northern France, German forces requisitioned food, imposed harsh rules, and sometimes deported civilians for forced labor. Villages lived under watchful eyes of soldiers, caught between resistance and survival. Stories of atrocities, executions, burning towns circulated widely, fueling Allied propaganda. Far beyond Europe, colonial subjects also lived the war. In India, farmers grew food for Britain, while soldiers shipped abroad. In Africa, villagers were forced to carry supplies in military campaigns, often under appalling conditions. In French West Africa, families watched their sons sent to the trenches in Europe, where many died in cold, foreign fields. For these communities, the war was not a patriotic choice, but an imperial demand. Civilians everywhere lived with constant uncertainty. Telegrams arrived with devastating news. Families prayed for letters from sons and husbands at the front, clinging to every word. Newspapers printed casualty lists that seemed endless. In many towns, church bells tolled for the dead so often that silence itself became rare. Yet, amid the hardship, people adapted. They found small joys, concerts, theater, holidays celebrated in muted ways. Soldiers on leave reunited with families, bringing both relief and awkwardness as the gap between battlefield and home grew wide. Communities supported one another through charities, soup kitchens, and volunteer efforts. And then there was grief. The scale of loss was staggering. Every community had empty chairs at tables, every street missing familiar faces. Mourning became part of daily life. Women in black were a common sight, widows who would never remarry because so many men were gone. Children grew up fatherless, their lives shaped by absence. The war also transformed politics on the home front. Civilians enduring sacrifice demanded a voice. Strikes broke out in Germany, Britain, and Russia. In Petrograd, hunger protests grew into revolution, toppling the Tsar. In Austria-Hungary, food shortages fueled unrest among diverse nationalities, hastening the empire's collapse. Propaganda was everywhere. Posters urged men to enlist, women to work, families to save food. Films portrayed the enemy as brutal and the cause as just. Yet by 1917-1918, many civilians could see the gap between propaganda and reality. They knew the war was dragging on, and they bore its weight daily. Perhaps the most poignant reminder of civilian endurance lies in the simple fact that life continued. Babies were born. Schools held classes, though often interrupted. Couples married, sometimes in haste before husbands returned to the front. Even in wartime, humanity persisted. ordinary acts of love, work, and resilience against extraordinary odds. When the war ended in 1918, civilians faced both relief and devastation. Cities welcomed soldiers home with parades, but the absence of the dead was overwhelming. Orphans and widows struggled. Economies were shattered, inflation rampant. And then the Spanish flu struck, taking millions more. For many civilians, peace felt almost as cruel as war. In the memory of the First World War, the soldier's experience often dominates. But the civilian story is just as vital. It reminds us that total war touches everyone, that battles are only one part of the story, and that endurance at home was as decisive as bravery at the front. And in those kitchens, fields, factories, and classrooms, ordinary people carried the burden of the war to end all wars, a burden that shaped generations. We have traveled far together in this story, from the assassination in Sarajevo to the trenches of the Western Front, from Verdun and the Somme to the revolutions of 1917, from the final offensives of 1918 to the Peace of Versailles, and finally through the cultural, social, and global legacies that shaped the 20th century. Now, at the end of our journey, we return to the central question: why was it called the war to end all wars, and what does that phrase truly mean? The phrase was first used during the war itself. It appeared in speeches, in newspapers, on posters. It captured a hope, perhaps even a prayer, that the immense suffering of the conflict would not be repeated. People looked at the rivers of blood, the shattered villages, the endless cemeteries, and thought, surely, if humanity has endured this, it will never endure it again. The very scale of the sacrifice, they believed, would force a new world into being. Woodrow Wilson embraced the phrase when he called for a League of Nations. For him, the war was not only about defeating Germany, but about transforming the way nations dealt with one another. He imagined diplomacy replacing violence, cooperation replacing rivalry. His vision was idealistic, but it resonated deeply in a world desperate for meaning. For ordinary people, too, the phrase offered comfort. Parents who had lost sons, widows who had lost husbands, soldiers who had lost comrades. They all wanted to believe that their grief had purpose, that their sacrifices were not wasted, that from the mud of the trenches something better might grow. But as we have seen, history did not grant that hope. The Treaty of Versailles, with its bitterness and punishments, planted seeds of resentment. The League of Nations proved weak, unable to stop new aggressions. Nationalism, fascism, and militarism rose again, and within 20 years, the world was plunged into an even more devastating war. So, was the phrase wrong? Was it a tragic lie? Perhaps not entirely. The war did not end all wars, but it did change forever the way humanity thought about war. It shattered illusions. It stripped away the romanticism of cavalry charges and banners flying. It showed war as it truly is: mud, gas, machine guns, endless attrition. The poets and painters of the war made sure of that. Their works remain as stark testimony, ensuring that no one could ever again speak of war as clean or glorious without contradiction. The First World War also began a process of international cooperation, however flawed. The League of Nations may have failed, but it laid groundwork for the United Nations after the Second World War. The dream of collective security, of dialogue instead of arms, was born from 1914-1918, even if it was not realized immediately. And the war reshaped societies in ways that endure. It accelerated democracy, expanded women's rights, inspired independence movements, and transformed culture. In that sense, it was not the end of all wars, but the end of an old world. The 19th century, with its empires, monarchies, and illusions of endless progress, died in the trenches. The modern world was born in its place. The irony, then, is that the war to end all wars did not end war, but it ended an era. It forced humanity to confront itself in new ways. It left scars, but also lessons. And though those lessons were not fully heeded in the 1930s, they remain with us today. When we stand at the graves of the fallen, when we observe 2 minutes of silence on November 11th, when we pin a poppy to our lapel, we are not only remembering the dead. We are remembering the hope that animated them, the belief that their sacrifice might buy a better future. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the phrase, not prophecy, but aspiration. Not a description of what the war achieved, but a challenge to us, to ensure that such a war does not happen again. It is easy in hindsight to dismiss the words as naive. But imagine yourself in 1916, standing knee-deep in mud, hearing the thunder of artillery, surrounded by death. Would you not cling to the hope that this war would be the last? That your suffering, your friends' suffering, your nation's suffering would not be repeated? The war to end all wars was not a statement of fact. It was a cry of humanity, a plea to history. And so we are left with the question, have we listened? The 20th century answered with another great war, with conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. The dream of ending war has not yet been realized, but neither has it been abandoned. Each generation must decide anew whether to heed the lessons of 1914-1918, that pride and fear can ignite catastrophe, that peace without justice is fragile, that memory must be preserved. As we end this journey together, picture once more the fields of northern France and Belgium, the white crosses, the rows of names carved into stone, the silence that hangs heavy in the air. In that silence lies both grief and warning. It tells us that war is easy to begin, hard to end, and never truly won. It tells us that humanity has within it both destruction and resilience. And it challenges us. Will we let their sacrifice be only memory, or will we let it shape our future? The First World War is over, but its echoes are not. They live in borders, in politics, in art, in memory. And they live in the simple, fragile hope carried by those who fought and died, that someday, perhaps, there might truly be a war to end all wars.